I think we need more investment that really brings farmers to the table in conceptualizing and prioritizing the research so that the research that we're doing is designed to meet farmers' needs. Gets the research sort of out of the lab and into the field. That we've constantly been moving through these big breakthroughs that have really unlocked the potential of agriculture. And I think that we're continuing to do those. I don't want to lose sight of the fact that research is long-term and it's very incremental at the same time. So I think what a breakthrough right now is our ability to integrate across disciplines. You have crop breeding, you have animal science, you have data science. And I think that because we're so connected, and I think there's a really a new philosophy around converging sort of all these different research disciplines together, that could be a breakthrough, is the fact that we can address a problem by bringing different disciplines together. As consumers really start to get an understanding of what goes into their food system and are really asking for and demanding a more sustainable food system, it might be the same hamburger, but it's going to come from cattle that are producing less methane and contributing less to climate change. It might be the same tortilla, but it's come from corn that is much more drought tolerant and farmers can grow it at a greater profit. And so many companies recognize this, that consumers really want a more sustainable food. And the companies have made commitments. They say, you want it, we're going to deliver it. And now the companies are trying to figure out how to deliver that.
Please join our next seminar in the Catalyst of Change series on January 30th.
Welcome to the Catalyst of Change Women Leaders in Science seminar series. There is interpretation available in Spanish, French, and Hindi. To access interpretation, you choose the language of your preference by clicking the translation button at the base of your Zoom screen. This seminar will be recorded and made available on the CIMMYT webcast. We invite you to follow us in LinkedIn, YouTube, and social media using the hashtag Women in Science for the Catalyst of Change Women Leaders in Science seminar series. On the screen, you will see the QR code that will give you access to Slido for submitting questions and comments to be addressed in the Q&A session. Today, we will be hearing from a very distinguished leader in agriculture research and development, Saharah Moon Chapotin, Executive Director of the Foundation for Food and Agriculture Research. Right after her presentation, Saharah Moon Chapotin will have a conversation with Sarah Hearn, CIMMYT Genetic Resources Program Director. Now, I would like to welcome Brian Gobards, Director General of CIMMYT, to officially open the event and welcome our distinguished speaker of today. Dr. Gobards, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Isabella, as always, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening for those that are connected online in any of our channels, be it LinkedIn, YouTube, Twitter, or X, or here on Zoom. Today is, once again, a Catalyst of Change Women Leaders in Science webinar. And as you know, we launched at CIMMYT this TED Talk meets fireside chat style series on women leaders, because when we were reflecting on how to be a more inclusive organization, an organization with different leadership styles, we found out we need to look at other women leaders. How have they taken on the challenge of leading in science? How have they been a catalyst of change through their life journey, through lessons and insights that they can bring to the table? Therefore, in this series, we highlight women who are leaders in all sorts of capacities, fields, and disciplines from within CIMMYT that have a conversation with those leaders outside CIMMYT, but within our realm of our action and where we implement our actions. Leadership styles can take many different forms, from those leading in their community up to those leading one of the biggest organizations that transform today our food and agriculture systems. And today, Saharah Moon Chapotin is for sure a catalyst of change. Our guest speaker today, not only as Executive Director of the Foundation for Food and Agriculture Research, better known as FFAR, and one of CIMMYT's key partners, leads the foundation in support of its vision, but also in its transformation toward a world in which pioneering collaborative science provides every person access to affordable, nutritious food grown in thriving farms. Saharah is a plant scientist passionate about the role of agriculture and research in solving problems. She's committed to building especially partnerships and therefore inclusive partnerships in support of this vital science. Dr. Saharah Moon Chapotin offers decades of experience bringing the best of global science on issues ranging from climate change to food security, nutrition, and agricultural productivity. Prior to FFAR in August 2022, she held roles across the US government, including the US Department of Agriculture, the Smithsonian Institute, the US Botanical Garden, where she served as the executive director, and the US Agency for International Development, where she served as the deputy assistant administrator and worked to advance the US government's global hunger and food security initiative, Feed the Future. As a matter of fact, I personally had the honor as a young scientist to travel with her in India when she was overseeing CIMMYT's USAID investment there. And thanks to her, CIMMYT set up water conserving practices in the IGP. But especially, CIMMYT was invited, championed by her vision to be a better partner and become a more inclusive organization while operating and integrating those projects and interventions. Early in her career, Chapotin completed fellowships at Iowa State University, the National Academies, and the American Association for the Advancement of Science, working in issues of scientific communication, national security, and agriculture biotechnology. She further conducted research on forest ecology and canopy biology throughout the US, Madagascar, but also in Latin America, more specifically Costa Rica. Chapotin holds a bachelor's degree in biology from Stanford University and a doctorate in plant physiology from Harvard University. If all that is not proven off, that today we really have a catalyst of change, I am sure you will be convinced at the end of this seminar. Saharah, over to you.
Good morning, good evening, wherever you are. Wonderful to be here. Thank you so much, Bram, for that introduction. It's a treat to be back at CIMMYT. As Bram said, I have worked with CIMMYT for many years and just really appreciate the partnership that I've had with CIMMYT over the years. So I think I'm supposed to tell you a little bit about who I am, how I got where I am, and what my journey as a leader has been like. And so I will start first with where I am now, and then kind of go back to the beginning and tell you a little bit about how I got here. But I work at the Foundation for Food and Agriculture Research, and we establish public-private partnerships to support food and agriculture research. We work with scientists all over the world, and we leverage the investment in the public sector and grow it by partnering with the private sector. And so the mandate that we have received from Congress, we receive funding from the United States government. The mandate we've received from Congress is to match every dollar we receive with at least $1 in non-federal funding. And FAR, as we call ourselves, has exceeded that. We've matched it with $1.40. So that means that every dollar that we've received through public investment, we have more than matched it with private investment. And so that just brings more resources into the public domain and more investment in agriculture research. And I think if you are all on this call, you know the power of agriculture research in addressing both problems and issues within agriculture, but also across society at large. As for the many years I worked in development, I was able to see the very, very impactful, important role of investing in agriculture to a country's overall development and economic growth. So how did I get to FAR? Well, I wasn't sure how far back to go, but I'll start at the beginning. I grew up in California. I had my father was from here in the United States and my mother from France. So sort of from the very beginning, kind of had an international background. And my parents chose to homeschool me and my siblings. And so I never went to school. We learned at home, sometimes as we were traveling around the world. And I was always interested in science and the natural world. Know what a career in the sciences would look like. I didn't grow up with any sort of professional role models. I'll say my parents led an alternative lifestyle, and so did the other adults we knew. And so I'd never met a scientist. I don't think sort of maybe at a museum or something. I didn't know any professors, and I certainly didn't know what happened in graduate school. But somehow I knew I wanted to do all of that, and I did, and and just, spent a lot of time reading about focusing on science. I think National Geographic issues were my early inspiration. But at the same time, I had other interests. I danced. I was interested in the circus arts as a teenager. I got involved in the circus arts and studied trapeze, and I loved being up high. I loved nothing better than being up in a tree or being up at the top of a mountain. And so I got to a point sort of as I was a teenager of thinking, well, what am I going to do with myself? Am I going to go off and be a scientist, or am I going to do something in the performing arts? And I don't know if I ever would have been circus material, but I enjoyed it very much. And I sort of came to the conclusion over the course of going to college that I could combine the two and study trees. And so I did that. First I went to community college near my home, and then I transferred to Stanford University and studied biology. And then I took some time off and worked in the field as a field biologist. I graduated from college pretty young. I was 19 here in the United States. Most people graduate from college at 22. And I decided I didn't want to be the youngest person in the room anymore. So I took some time and I did internships um, studying forest ecology and canopy biology here in the United States before eventually going back to graduate school at Harvard University, where I studied tree physiology. And again, this was combining my desire to be up in the canopy, to be up high. I loved heights, and doing fun science. And so I studied tree biology in Madagascar and in Costa Rica. And my thesis focused on baobab trees, which those of you who've been to Africa certainly will know what they are. But there are 6 species of baobabs in Madagascar, and I studied those. I was studying their physiology, their water relations, and how they grow and how they survive in these dry climates. And that was great. It was a lot of fun. I loved studying trees. It was also really hard. I was working in very remote areas with very little connection back to my lab in the United States. I think I got through it mostly through sheer willpower, just sort of you get up every day and you lug your gear into the forest and you climb a bunch of trees. And it was great. And then, when I wasn't there, I was back in Boston, Cambridge, in Massachusetts, and at Harvard, which of course is an amazing school and known around the world. But my experience there was I didn't look around me and see many role models, especially for women. And by role models, I mean women who had careers there, who were professors, who seemed to have a balance between their work life and their home life. People were very driven and worked very hard, often into the wee hours of the night. And it was hard to see myself doing that. I felt like I saw more examples of what I shouldn't become or I shouldn't do, in the sense of people perhaps not really enjoying their lives as scientists. And I say particularly women. There weren't as many women faculty in our department then. And so, as I was finishing up graduate school, I was sort of trying to figure out, well, what do I do with the rest of my life? And as I said, I hadn't seen any great examples. And again, growing up, I hadn't seen anyone who had that professional life either. And I say that just because we talk a lot about mentors and the ability of young people to see people who look like them. And, I'm a white woman. There are certainly plenty of white women in my life growing up, and people who were professionals as I went through college and graduate school. But again, when I was little, I didn't see anyone who looked like that and that I could talk to and understand what it would mean to have a career in science. So, in a way, I was sort of figuring it out on my own, which I think is what a lot of young people have to do. So when I was in Madagascar, I think that was really formative for me, because I saw firsthand the tension between poverty and conservation and agriculture. And I could see forests being cut down for agriculture. And I could see why that was happening. And I could see how families were really just trying to feed their children, and they weren't, trying to destroy the environment. They had simply no other choices. And so when I was finishing up my graduate school work, I decided not to stay in science as a researcher, but instead I would move into other areas where I felt I could have more societal impact. And so I I decided to move more into the policy world. But I think it's worth saying, and I've spent a lot of time over the years thinking about that decision because I love the science and I miss it. And there are days where I would love to be back doing microscopy or electronics or climbing a tree or nerding out or basically doing anything other than sitting at a computer. And, I think at the time, I also probably didn't have the confidence to stay in research and be a research professor. And, as I said, I was young. I hadn't seen a lot of people do it and be successful at it. And and I think plenty of people, especially when they're young, lack the confidence to do things, men and women. But I know that I felt that very strongly, and I doubted my ability to do that. And had I stayed, I probably would have been had a successful career as a researcher. But instead, I found a very impactful career, still working in science, but in grant making and development and grants management. And I've had a tremendous amount of fun doing that as well. So I moved to Washington, D.C., the seat of the US government, to do policy work. I was very interested in biotechnology and agriculture. I knew I was a plant scientist, but I wanted to be in a more applied field, and applying that knowledge and experience in agriculture felt like it could be exciting. I did not go to a big agriculture school. I had never studied agriculture in either college or graduate school. And to this day, I feel like I missed out on some things. That I had a wonderful education, obviously, at the universities I attended, but I didn't get that early exposure to agriculture. So I eventually landed a wonderful fellowship working at the United States Agency for International Development, which is the U.S. government's foreign assistance agency, and that was a wonderful opportunity that launched my career in managing and supporting agricultural research. I worked initially on biotechnology projects, eventually grew to cover the whole research portfolio, and then for a long time led the agricultural research portfolio at USAID. And Dr. Govertz mentioned that we were working together in South Asia. I had the fantastic opportunity of helping to create the Cereal Systems Initiative for South Asia, which was such a formative experience for me and such an amazing program, and got me out in the field where I learned so much about agriculture and farmers, and the role of men and women in farming and in other areas of agriculture. I grew to see that although there were many women in agriculture, and those of you who do field work obviously know that farmers across the world are women. There are fewer women in science, and particularly in many of the countries where I worked, there were few opportunities for women to lead a scientific career. And so that was an interesting observation to think about. Who is serving all these women who are farmers, and how do we ensure that the research we are doing is taking their needs into account? And then I also saw the way that I was treated as a woman coming from the United States, a woman of privilege working for a funding agency, and the respect that was accorded to me, versus the way that women perhaps didn't have the same opportunities in many of the countries where I visited, or in the United States. We face some of the same challenges here. But I also got to learn so much about including women in the development process, and really had tremendous respect for the work that USAID was doing in positioning gender as such a clear priority for our development work, and really had the chance to both learn about and advance metrics on how women are included in agriculture and development, and also just really thinking through how you grow that inclusivity from the position of being a granting agency, which is a tremendous privilege. So as I reflect on what it meant to work as a woman in science, and again as a woman involved in science, not obviously directly doing the research or holding a research position myself, I felt like I have actually been extraordinarily fortunate and had tremendous opportunities. And if I think back to sort of what it felt like to work, I actually realized that for me, age was actually usually a bigger deal than gender. I just happened to be the youngest person in the room most of the time, especially when I joined USAID. It was before a big hiring push they had done to bring in more foreign service officers and more younger officers. And so I, almost always found myself with the youngest person among my peers. And I think sometimes as the young person in the room, you're not taken seriously, perhaps more so because I was a woman, but I think I felt I was more likely to notice the fact that I was younger and just lacked years of experience that others around me had. And that tends to influence how you approach um, your work and how your self-confidence for sure. Um, but I always, that's where I say I was so fortunate. I always had supportive mentors and managers, both men and women, throughout my career. I had a fantastic advisor in graduate school. I had a wonderful series of bosses at USAID, and I had just very talented colleagues, including some throughout the CGIR who really taught me so much about agriculture and food, and who also ensured I got leadership opportunities and ensured I got the credit for the work I did. One of the people I worked with at USAID was just so well known for sharing the credit, and always said, you get credit by sharing it. And a person who would always ensure that everyone in the room was recognized for the work they had done. And that's, I think that is so important, especially as you're looking to empower people who are not always given leadership roles in the workplace. But I should also say that the US government was a good place to be a woman leader, at least in my agencies. There are policies that are in place that are designed to prevent discrimination. And there were great examples of women in leadership roles that I didn't see as much when I was out working in the agriculture world or the science world. And so, in that sense, I know that I was able to take advantage of a workplace that did value the contributions of women and ensure that both men and women could have leadership roles. In fact, in the bureau where I worked, the majority of the people in a leadership role were women, and that was something that was kind of cool. But as I worked around the world, I found myself paying attention to gender ratios. It was just something I did. I had been to a large meeting in South Asia and a series of visits. And over the course of that visit, I realized that I had met and been introduced to perhaps over 100 men and maybe a dozen women. And many of those women worked for international organizations or USAID and not the host country. And so that just sort of something that stuck with me. And I found myself doing that over the years. Every time I walk into a large meeting room, I'll do a quick check. How many women do we have in this room? How many men? And now often I'll do, how many white people do we have and how many people of color? And what does that mean? And how can we, now that I'm more and more in the position of being in the role of organizing the meetings or inviting the participants, how can I ensure that we are bringing a balance to the work we do and giving opportunities to women and people of color to have those leadership roles and to be at the table and to be in the conversations. And then as I continued to move up in government and started a family, I began to also see how I could be impactful in changing the dynamics of gender in the workplace through my role as, at that point, a fairly senior woman in government with very young children. I started a new position in the senior executive service. So this is sort of the highest level of service for civil servants in the US government. And I started that position right as I came back from my first maternity leave. So I had a new baby. I was also a single parent. I chose to have my children on my own. So I was doing this on my own. And I mean, it was crazy. It was a lot of work. I don't recommend starting a new job after a maternity leave. But I also realized that in my new position, I could set the example for what it meant to be a working parent in a leadership role. And so I, if I had to if I had to leave a meeting to go pick up my kids, I would say so to everyone in the room, because then other people in the room see that this is what you do. You're a leader, you also have kids, and you have family obligations. And so I always tried to normalize that. Um, as I was a nursing mother, if I had to go to the lactation room, I would say so. Or if I couldn't attend a meeting because I had to do that, I would say so. And so I sort of figured, if I couldn't talk about that in my role, then who could? And how could women who didn't have that security in their position feel that they could balance their family obligations with their work obligations? So that was a privilege for me to be able to do that, and to be able to just to take advantage of my role to both normalize what it meant to be a working parent. So I left USAID in 2018 and moved to the US Botanic Garden, which was a wonderful opportunity. I was excited to be back in the plant sciences, which had always been a passion of mine, and got to lead a wonderful institution. If you've ever been to Washington, D.C., it's the conservatory right at the base of the Capitol building, just a gorgeous place. And I was there when COVID started and the garden closed down, as did so many cultural institutions around the world. And so that was another interesting dynamic. And I know many of you, if you have children, experience those years of months or years, depending on where you lived, of having to work and have children who maybe couldn't attend school. DC schools were closed for a long time. And so, but again, it was another opportunity to be a leader and to demonstrate what it meant to balance those family obligations under extraordinarily difficult times during COVID. And so, I had people who came to me and thanked me for being so open about having my children on my Zoom calls with me. And I was like, well, where else were they going to go? The schools are closed. But it gave them permission to do the same. And so I think that's really important for those of us who are women leaders to sort of own the broader dynamics of being a person and having a life if we're people who have children. So I think that's probably as much as I need to say right now. I'm looking forward to the conversation and to speaking with you all and with Sarah.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Saharah. And hello, everyone joining this webinar. My name is Sarah Hearn, and I'm a member of CIMMYT's Women in Crop Science group. And I really wanted to interview Saharah because she really speaks to the integration of diversity in science, calling out to multidisciplinary approaches to address the challenges farmers face today and will face tomorrow. And so I'd like to start, Saharah, by asking you to reflect a little bit on your journey. And you talked a little bit to this, but when you look at your career through science, do you think, or could you highlight any areas that you really think have changed for women in science and women in science leadership?
I think a tremendous amount has changed. And I'll say, I think we're also dealing with some of the same old issues. But, since I was just talking about families, I think, at least in the United States, I think a lot has changed for working parents, working mothers in particular, but working parents. And I'll always recall being in graduate school and using the restrooms in our building and hearing this strange noise coming through the stall of the person in the stall next to me, and finally figuring out that, it was a woman using a breast pump right there in the bathroom because she had nowhere else to go. And in the United States, where many people, then and still don't have maternity leave, she had no choice but to come back to work.
Yeah.
And so, I think one of it's a small thing, but one of my proudest accomplishments of my time at the Botanic Garden is that there are now 3 lactation rooms, 1 in every building. And those didn't exist before I was there. So that's on the family side. I think there's a much more open conversation right now about what it means to be a woman in science. And I think that I think we knew it and felt it, but didn't talk about it as much when I was younger. And certainly it wasn't, people around me weren't talking about it. It wasn't a conversation I heard amongst faculty. And I think now, especially in academia in the United States, there's a very open conversation about what it means to be a woman in science. And I think that's also a big change.
Mm-hmm. And you find yourself, how engaged are you with those conversations as a leader?
Yeah, I less so in academia, but certainly in government. That was, I was frequently in those conversations, or trying to make them happen when they weren't happening. And the nonprofit world is, at least in the United States, it is an interesting place because it actually has great representation of women. And my organization has way more women than men, and it was that way before I joined. And so it's interesting I found myself in conversations about, well, why is that? Why is it that if you're in the science side doing the research, there's more men? And on the nonprofit side, perhaps managing the research or research adjacent, there are more women. And is there something about the lifestyle that we're able to offer through these jobs that are different, that causes men or women to stay in different positions?
Yeah, no, I mean, it's interesting reflecting on that. And there's also that element, and you mentioned it as well. So the lovely quote that we often use during this series from Marion White, and you paraphrased it about you can't be what you can't see. And so reflecting the profit, non-profit, funder, science implementation side, as you mentioned, yeah, you often see more women in one sphere rather than another. And thinking about that in the broader context, how do you as a leader ensure those broader areas of inclusion? You mentioned age, culture, nationality, those kinds of background effects. How are they considered and reflected in the work that we do, so that we are really moving to be more inclusive in science and really reflecting many who are underrepresented in addition to women and those gender aspects?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think the obvious place that many of us start is in our recruitment and employment practices, and being very thoughtful about when we put out job announcements, how do we describe the work and describe the job in a way that makes people feel like it was written for them? And I've heard a lot about just if you put the qualifications required at the top versus the bottom, that can really change whether someone even chooses to apply for the job. So I think that that's a place to start. And then, of course, the workplace policies that make places a supportive place to work, especially for parents, if someone's a parent and wants to continue to have that career in science. But I think it goes well beyond who we hire, of course. I think it goes to, this is something that my current organization, FFAR, thinks a lot about, is how do we ensure that our programming is accessible and inclusive and equitable? And how are we ensuring that people, either from colleges, universities that don't often participate as much in the agricultural research enterprise, perhaps a smaller college and something that's not a large agriculture university, how do researchers at those universities participate in our programs? And as I mentioned at the outset, we require this matching funds arrangement. And so if we expect the applicant to find their matching funds, then those who have those connections to industry, perhaps work at larger universities, may have an advantage. And if we can think about other ways to bring those matching funds in, then those who work at smaller colleges that historically serve minority populations or don't have big agriculture connections, how do we construct our RFAs, our calls for proposals, in a way that they can participate fully as well? Because then their students will also be participating in the research process. And that gives, especially for colleges that have been historically Black or have minority students, that gives those students a chance to engage in the agriculture research enterprise and to see what that career could look like, and what that field could look like, and give them the confidence that there's place for them in it, and that's where they should stay.
And so thinking of that, what kinds of tools are you using? What kinds of tools do you find effective in really opening up and encouraging participation of non-traditional partners, if you look at it that way?
Well, I think that we have a scientific workforce development program. So thinking about our fellowship programs and training programs are, I think, a wonderful way to give students a feeling of inclusion in the agricultural sciences, or in science in general, but we focus on the agricultural sciences, a feeling of inclusion and a path forward. And so one of our fellowship programs has a very strong professional development component, and gives fellows a cohort of peers that they can engage with, and it gives them exposure to different fields of science. It brings them to Washington, D.C. to engage with policymakers. And so those kinds of experiences, I think, are so formative. And then if you design these programs and recruit in such a way that, again, you are making them feel inclusive and welcoming of people of all backgrounds, you can build that more diverse cohort. And, a student who might have studied something else might realize that they can study agriculture and make a career, and that there are people like them in that field. Or even if there's not that many people like them, they can see how people like them could be welcomed and grow a career in that field.
Yeah. Okay. Excellent. That's a really nice example. And one thing that you mentioned earlier, and I'd love to focus on it, is confidence. And I was talking with a recruiter recently who reaffirmed from their own experience that men will typically apply for a new opportunity when they meet 60 to 70% of the job requirements, while women will often look to have 90% to a complete match. Now, yeah, that could be attributed to overconfidence in men or underconfidence in women, or some kind of mix between the two. But what is clear is in science fields, even within biological sciences, as we move up the hierarchies of seniority, we have fewer and fewer women applicants. Now, there's many other drivers behind that, but what advice would you give to women regarding their confidence? And you mentioned when you were younger, you maybe felt underconfident. So how do you inspire women to really have that confidence to take on leadership roles? And how can we move that towards getting better parity, at least in recruitment?
Yeah, that's such a great question. And I think self-confidence obviously starts so young, right? It builds on patterns of just our own experiences as children and young people. And so, by the time you're in your 20s and applying for jobs, that's all happened to you, whatever it is. It's you've experienced that. And so building my own confidence has just been a lifelong journey. I was a very shy, I'm an introvert. I still, drop me in a room full of people and I'm going to have to kind of steel myself up, like, talk myself through, go over and walk over to that person and say hello. It's not something that comes naturally to me. But when I was younger, and especially because I was often younger than my peers, I remember in college, I went to a professor's office and I wanted to ask them about doing research. And I stood outside their door and I never knocked. I walked away. I just couldn't do it. And so I don't know what could have been done for me to help me grow that. It's something I ended up having to do myself, very painstakingly over time. And I think, yeah, okay, here's one thing. Over the course of my career, there were occasional moments when someone would say something about me and my work that was complimentary and that was so meaningful. And I never thought of myself as a good writer. The first article I tried to write in graduate school just got panned by some professor who had a beef with my professor. And, I just felt like, oh my God, I can't write. I'm terrible. I don't know what I'm doing. And so, a few years later, I'm at USAID and someone said, well, I think you're one of the best writers on this team. And my jaw just about dropped. And I was like, what do you mean? I'm a terrible writer. I've always struggled with writing. But I heard him and I thought about it and I thought, okay, maybe I can write. And that was such a confidence booster. So little moments like that. So I think what that translates into is the work that we can all do to give that feedback to our peers. And when you see someone who particularly is younger or newer in a role, and it's easy to assume that everyone else has the confidence we don't have. And I'm, as I've gotten to know many women over the years, I'm realizing that none of us have the confidence. We all assume everyone else has it, but we're all just pretending, and we're all walking into a room trying to pretend the confidence that we don't feel.
Yeah. And I think it's really nice to hear people like you in very senior leadership positions be open about that. So it's, again, talking to that space of, being able to reflect and be open around some of the challenges that we all face. And yeah, you mentioned heights, and that would be one space where I would have zero confidence. Yeah, put me underwater, I'm fine. Put me high up in the sky, I turn into a jelly. And so you talked to your continued passion for heights, and I see you were in an aerial arts program director at a camp somewhere. So I guess that's the passion for circus arts still shining through.
Mm-hmm.
So how important to you are non-work pursuits, and how do you use those or do you use them to keep you grounded and inspired? Really thinking about that work-life balance and how important that non-family, non-work kind of pursuit and hobby is.
I mean, I think it's incredibly important, but I also think that it's something we talk a lot about, and truly having the luxury of a personal life as a working parent is elusive. And I think that's true for people across the world. And so I think for a long time, my version of work-life balance was having enough time to do my work and having enough time to be with my children. And frankly, everything else was off the table because my kids were young, and I was single parenting, and then COVID hit. And so then I didn't even try. It was just like, survival mode, with schools being closed for so long. But so I think, for those of you out there with young children, there's hope on the other end of the tunnel. So my children are now 6 and almost 9, and they can be, counted on to sit quietly for an hour. And so I've started dancing again. I danced all through my childhood and through my adult life. And about 10 years ago, I stopped and had some kids. And so I go to a dance class every Sunday afternoon, and my kids sit in the corner and they listen to audiobooks on their tablet, and they're fine with it. And they mostly stay quiet. And I get to do something I love, which also, you get to a certain age and you got to remember how to move your body and stay fit and continue to stay flexible. And so it taps into something for me that I've spent my whole life doing and really have missed. And I for the longest time, I just could not figure out how to make that work. I was like, do I get a babysitter to go to a dance class? That feels disruptive for the family. And so, yeah, been able to do things like that feels important.
Yeah. And I think it's nice for everybody who has young children to hear that, that you get over certain ages and opportunities open up again, which is, very, very good to hear for a lot of people. And finally, just to wrap up our conversation, if you had to give 1 or 2 pieces of advice to a young woman or a young man who is interested in moving into a career in science, what advice would you give, really reflecting on your career journey?
As far as moving into a career in science, I think there are many ways to be a scientist, and some of them involve standing at a lab bench and doing that kind of work. Some of them involve field work, and some of them involve a career more like I've taken, where you are advancing and building and supporting science without doing it yourself. And I think those are all wonderful ways to engage in science. And those are just a handful, right? There are so many other ways. And so I think if someone is interested in having an impact on the world, or if someone is just thinks science is cool and wants to be involved, I think that there's an idea, at least in this country, that you have to be a professor at a university. And that's certainly one way to do it. But there are so many other ways. I've known scientists in industry who've had fantastic careers. Scientists in government, I think being in government is a wonderful way to influence the scientific enterprise. So I think it's that there are so many ways to do it, and that people are really willing to talk about it. And even though it can be terrifying, it's important to reach out and hear from people who have had various careers, and almost everyone will spend 30 minutes talking about that. And if they won't, someone else will.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you very much for that. So very much enjoyed having this conversation with you. I'd love to go on longer, but I'll hand over to Isabel so that she can field some questions from the audience. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. So we appreciate Saharah Moon Chapotin and Sarah Hearn for this stimulating and enlightening conversation. Now we would like to open the floor for questions from the audience. We invite you to raise your hand, to turn on your camera, and unmute yourself if you would like to ask a question or comment, or you can submit it via Slido. Here you can see the Slido code, or you can find it also in the chat. So our first question received from the Slido tool is, you have been interacting with CIMMYT over the years. As an outsider, what change have you seen and what can we do better?
That's a good question. I feel like years ago when I was at USAID, I spent a lot of time engaging with CIMMYT staff, both in the field and at CIMMYT. And I'd say I haven't had that opportunity directly more recently. So it's a little hard to say how things have changed. But I know that when I was working in South Asia with several CIMMYT staff who had a leadership role in the CISA program, I was always impressed with the way that they worked in the field to be gender inclusive and to consider the needs of women and women farmers. And so very frequently I would show up for a field visit and 100 women would have come out from a women's group to meet with us and talk to us. And so that work that I saw in the field in terms of engaging women farmers directly, I think is so important. And I hope that has continued in the work that CIMMYT continues to do today.
Excellent. So here we have Vivanji Chimonio. She would like to make a question. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Sarah, for your talk. It was quite inspirational. So my question relates to, the time when women at school, they fall pregnant, and afterwards it takes a long time for them to get back into the groove of things. And some people actually fall off that bandwagon. They don't come back to school. They're now concentrating on family and things like that. Is it possible, or is there a fund where brilliant women out there who want to start a family but know that it might affect their career, they can at least apply for some relief, Are we there yet, or are we still too far from thinking that still there are women who want both worlds, want to start a family, want to do science, but having to choose their family over science is more like a financial thing that they cannot then. Are we there yet, or is there a fund that's there, or this is a good conversation to start going forward?
You raised such a wonderful point. And I would say it is entirely possible. And the reason I can say that is that there are so many countries in the world that offer really excellent maternity or parental leave benefits. And then there are laws that require that your position is made available to you and that you can't be discriminated against because you took time away. And then there are other countries, and United States is one of those, that have not offered those types of benefits and do not have laws that protect. So I think as a long-term strategy, I would say that having that built into the fabric of the country and having that be a norm of an expectation that whether you're in school or whether you're a working person, you can take time away to start a family and come back and resume your career. At an immediate sense, there are many countries in the world that don't have those protections and offer those benefits. And so I think that organizations can be creative about how they build that in for themselves and for their employees. And I was thrilled that when I joined the Foundation for Food and Agriculture Research, they had been working on a parental leave policy, and we were able to roll that out, just a few months after I arrived, and offer that leave and those protections to parents, both men and women, who wish to start a family. And so I think other institutions, if the structure doesn't exist at the national or the state level, can think about that. And I think it will ultimately pay off. It will be a benefit to the institution to support people in having families, because wonderful, brilliant women leave science or leave their career tracks because, as you said, they don't have that financial support. And that's a loss. That's a loss to those institutions and to society.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. So here we have another question from Slido. Do you see more awareness of diversity in science, especially among organizations and women? How can we involve men and conservatives more actively?
So yes, I think there is definitely a lot of attention now in institutions of science to women and building more diverse student bodies and employees. At least what I'm seeing here in the United States is that men and women are engaged in those conversations. And I agree that that's tremendously important. And I think there is good work being done now on why it's important to have diverse and inclusive organizations and workplaces. And a lot of that work is very data driven and science based. And so one of the ways to engage with some people who think like scientists, is to really share those data and to help people understand how that builds a stronger workplace. But there are many people for whom data and facts don't matter, and it's really it's what you kind of feel in your heart. And so I think also hearing stories about people and what it's meant to them to be in a diverse workplace, and when they were or weren't supported in their career, I think that human element is also so important. And you know, as they say, every man has most men have a mother or a sister or a daughter, and so sometimes having it be personal can also help to change hearts and minds and see the value of a diverse workplace. And I think also just those structures that we can put in place to support women then lead to successful examples of women raising families in the workplace, for example. There's lots of other ways to be a woman than to raise a family, obviously. But seeing that and seeing that work then helps to break down those preconceptions about how, you know, it has to be a choice, or a woman who has young children is maybe less reliable, say, than one who doesn't. You know, that's a preconception in the workplace. I certainly don't believe that myself.
Thank you. There is another question. There's a backlash in some parts of excuse me of the U.S. and other countries at the moment against diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts. What do you think we can do to build inclusion in the face of this backlash?
Well, that's like a big question. It's like a how do we all get along question. I mean, I think, you know, there's a lot you hear about sort of what is contributing to the breakdown in just discourse in society, and people being able to talk to each other and hear each other's thoughts and opinions. And so I think when you have that backlash and people pushing back, I think it's worth thinking about, well, what makes them feel threatened by this conversation? Why would they feel that this, you know, a conversation about equity and diversity and inclusion doesn't also benefit them? And so I you know, I always find it helpful to try to put myself in the other person's point of view. And, you know, is it someone who is also struggling financially and doesn't want to hear about how, you know, women have had a hard time and don't make as much because this person, maybe he's also having a hard time supporting his family. And so thinking through the many ways in which people are disadvantaged and understanding that we need to be inclusive of all of those ways helps to bring people into the conversation, I think.
Thank you so much. So here we have another participant that would like to make a question. Aileen, would you like to open your micro and your camera?
Hi, good morning. Thank you so much for this morning. It's been incredibly informative. I myself am not a scientist, but I work sort of in a similar vein, I suppose, to you in terms of supporting scientific organizations in their work in research for development. And I wondered, you know, one of the things that I find as a facilitator is sometimes I am concerned about how much I am overtaxing the female scientists who are working in these organizations, because since there are fewer of them, you know, sometimes we have a group of maybe 15, maybe 20 people, and there are only 2, 3, maybe 5 women who are part of that group. And we want to ensure that women's voices are at the table. I find I am often having to ask women to do more of the work and more of the labor around that. And I just wanted to know from your perspective as a facilitator, you know, how do you balance that in terms of wanting to enable women and give them a platform. And as you said, it's so important to show younger women and to show other people the work that female scientists are doing without simply adding so much labor to their roles.
No, I know exactly what you mean, and I've heard that discussed, and I've sort of occasionally gotten the invite that I was like, huh. As I look at the panel, I was like, well, I know, someone was trying to diversify that panel when I got that late invite. But I think you said it yourself in a way, trying to feature a broad diversity of people and younger people. I think that, as we reach out to people and invite them to participate, and if they're not able to, or giving them that opening to, I understand that you're busy and you may not be able to, but do you know another person who would benefit from being on the stage or who could share a point of view that would be valuable? And so sometimes it might be reaching out to someone who doesn't fit the profile of the eminent leader on the stage, if it's a high level event, for example, and inviting a more junior person or someone from a slightly different field to be a part of it, so that you're still showcasing the breadth and diversity of who can participate, but you're also, not placing that burden on the same obvious women leaders in their field. And, they may have mentees or students that they think could have that opportunity to really step up. And that can be so powerful for those women to have that opportunity, or young men. I think there's also a lot of value in knowing who can also share the story from a different perspective. So getting a man on a stage who speaks about his work in advancing gender equity and, bringing up young men and women is also so important and powerful.
Thank you so much. Thank you. So there is another question. If you have been able to receive a piece of advice as a young person, what would have if you had been able to receive a piece of advice as a young person that would have helped you, what would that be? And there is another related question. What have you been, the main obstacles that you've been across in your professional career, and what words of wisdom could you share with young and mid-career women professionals who might be struggling with similar issues? Thank you.
I'm trying to think, is there one piece of advice that could have really gelled for me? I think, it's had someone told me when I was in graduate school, you can do this, you can be a professor, go for it. I don't know if that would have, I don't think it would have gotten past my own self-doubt. But as I thought, something I've often said to people who joined the government the way I did through a fellowship program as scientists, was that if it's your seat at the table, take it. And government, for any of you who work in government, is often very hierarchical, and department heads sit at the table, and then people sit in the back and they're not supposed to speak. And so I often found myself representing my agency, but perhaps not being at the same level as others. But finally realizing that because I was representing my agency, that was my seat at the table. And even if I didn't look like those other people, I was going to march right up and take it and sit there and sort of almost request the not the respect, but the acknowledgement that you have a right to speak for your area. And so that's a very specific circumstance, but I think that more general sense of sometimes you have to just walk in and take the opportunity and be there, even if it's extraordinarily uncomfortable. And sometimes you might get ignored. You might be at that table and lets you speak, but you were still there and you were still putting yourself out there. And I think that's slowly over time how some things can change.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Saharah Moon Chapotin, for your great talk. We very much appreciate you sharing with us your professional and personal growth experience, being a successful leader, being a working single mother, finding the right balance between both and some other spheres of your personal and professional life. And thank you for being here today. Thank you so much for your time. So we thank also the audience for joining today, and we invite you to the following seminar, Catalyst of Change, Women Leaders in Science, on February 13th. Thank you.
Thank you.
When I can, I like to support our local farms. It makes me happy to know that I can buy peaches and apples and berries, around my area in Virginia and Maryland. I like to go to UPIC places too, because it's a fun experience for my daughter and I, but also importantly, that's a side income for farmers who choose to do that, right? Not only are they selling the products that they're making, but they're also charging admission and things like that. So that's one way that you can directly support farmers. SciMoms, we are a group of women who are moms, and then we're also scientists or science writers. And we came together quite a few years ago now, and from that experience and working together on that, we realized that we wanted to do more. But there's not as many products like the science communication resources that are available for moms or for, daycare providers or just like regular people, grocery store employees, just like folks who maybe they're not that interested in science, but they still have questions. And so we have been working really hard to put together resources on a variety of topics that are accessible to everyone.
Please join our next seminar in the Catalyst of Change series on February 13th.